so thank you, Namal and Swinal, the program directors, and my congratulations on the 10th anniversary of the program. And it's really my pleasure and honor to be able to speak to your students, right, on this very, I think, fascinating subject, which this program is about. So my lecture is going to be based on my experience, particularly in the last 10 years, when I was at the government think tank, the Center for Liveable Cities, but also draws a bit of my previous career experience in URA, in PUB, in PSA, and very briefly in Temasek. And so it's not just my work, but it's really the work of all the people in these agencies, the expertise there, where we have then tried to distill and share the knowledge that kind of Singapore has gained to a younger generation of people, students especially, younger professionals, to kind of distill the principles, right, from what Singapore has gone through. And I kind of summarize it, or CLC kind of summarize it as the urban systems approach, which is expressed in the Livability Framework. And that's what my talk is going to be primarily about today. So let's begin. All of you know this, right? We are a city country and a little island. So basically we are very, very resource challenged, right? No land, no water, energy, food, right? And yet we have to be both a city and country on this little island. And this is what we were like maybe not so long ago when I was a child, right? This was Singapore in the 50s and 60s. People like me were born after the World War II. This was the post-war baby boom. We had a kind of rapid population growth, and we were really a basket case of urbanization. You look at the picture, everything that could go wrong went wrong, right? We were overcrowded with slums. We had pollution, we had traffic jams, we had flooding, and we had droughts, right? Anything, that could have gone wrong in urbanization, you name it, we had it. And our population then was just 1.7 million, right? Not really very densely populated. And yet we were not doing well, from an urbanization point of view. But today, what we are. Today we are much more livable, much more sustainable, and I'll say more resilient city. And yet our population is tripled, right? So we are now 5.7 million and a lot more livable than what we were before, right? So the interesting question then is, what is it that has resulted in this transformation? What is livability, right? How do we measure livability? And actually, what I'm going to talk to you about is that livability outcomes are in fact quite easily measured, and there are tons of indicators and many indices to measure livability, right? And here I just give you a sample of some of those that CLC compiled, and you can find a lot more if you do your own research, and you can find thousands of livability indicators. So livability is something that you can feel it, right? You go to a city, you can feel, is this city livable or not, or is this city a bit of a mess, right? So it's kind of easy to obvious, and you can actually measure. But I think of greater interest to us, is it's not just the outcomes, right? The livability outcomes, but how do we achieve those livability outcomes? And in the case of Singapore, it is how did we get here, right? And if you look at this matrix of population density against livability, and there's so many rankings of livability, we just picked one of them, Mercer. And you can see, on the bottom, the horizontal axis, the most livable cities are on the right, so you see cities as Vancouver and Sydney, and then the least livable are on the left, right? So there's a ranking there. And then population density, right? The most dense are right up there. Dakar is 13,000, and then the least dense are below. And the interesting thing that you will find in this slide is that some of the most livable cities measured today by these kind of indices are also low density cities. And there are very few in this quadrant where Singapore is now high density and high livability. And we took this green path, right? We were less than 2 million, not very livable. And then over the years, we have progressed up this kind of higher density, but yet higher livability, path, if you like, right? Then the question is, how did we do this? And that really was what CLC was set up to do in 2008. Center for Liveable Cities, trying to really understand what were the principles that we were using in this transformation. And the idea being that if we can distill the principles, then those principles may still be relevant as we go forward. Here we have the dotted line. So are we going to go forward in this direction, or that direction? What are the principles that will help us to continue on a good development path, right? So CLC actually has done a lot of what we call urban system studies. They are basically case studies that look at some aspect of an urban problem or challenge that we faced in Singapore, whether it is water or cleaning the nation, the port, the built environment, tourism, land acquisition. So urban development, I think those are the areas that we studied in terms of how we have been able to achieve those outcomes through a series of interviews. We didn't just look at documents. We actually interviewed a lot of people who were involved in the actual solving of these problems, right? And then we document them in urban system studies. They are all freely available on the CLC website. So if you have time, you might want to read some of those. But the important thing is that we try to kind of distill from these urban system studies a kind of key principles, right? The framework, and the framework is this diagram. We call it the Livability Framework, or the urban systems approach, right? For planning and for developing a livable and sustainable city. And there's a reason why this livability framework is presented in this way, right? It's basically a circle with a triangle inside it, and then the circle has got light blue and dark blue. So if you imagine this is like an iceberg, right? A pyramidal iceberg that is kind of in water, and this is kind of the atmosphere. Then, as I said earlier, the outcomes, right? The livability outcomes of a city, the social outcomes, high quality of life, the environmental outcomes, sustainable environment, the economic outcomes, competitive economy, they're all quite measurable, and you can see these outcomes quite clearly, right? So it's above water. But below water, what is not so clear is how do you achieve these outcomes on a sustained basis, right? To create a livable and sustainable city. So in our case, I think having looked at all the urban system studies, we came to the conclusion that there were really two kind of foundational layers that embodies 10 principles that really constitute what we call the urban systems approach. And the reason is below water is that these principles are not so obvious, right? And I think even if you ask a lot of the urban pioneers, we call them urban pioneers, who did this, who kind of helped to solve our urban problems, you ask them what's the urban systems approach, they wouldn't be able to tell you. I mean, they did it intuitively. It was not something we invented, but in the process, because we were so severely constrained and we were forced in a way, to solve these problems, we kind of took this approach that is called the urban systems approach. Now, in hindsight, we can kind of give some principles and a little bit of theory to it. But the value there is that perhaps this theory, these principles can then be useful for us as we tackle our new challenges, right? So the principles are captured here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but it is kind of obvious when you read the urban system studies or the CLC book called the Livability Framework, right? So it's integrated master planning and development. It's really an approach of given that you have different silos where you're trying to solve different problems, water, housing, and so on, each problem cannot be solved on its own. You need to take a kind of a systems approach or an integrated approach. You need to think long term. You need to fight productively. In government, we like to say it's a whole of government approach. Agencies fight, but they fight with the idea of solving a problem, of coming with some innovation, right? And while you think long term, you try to also have flexibility. Your plans cannot be rigid. They must be able to be adjusted, with changing economic or social circumstances. And then the plans cannot remain as paper plans, right? The plans must be executed. They must be implemented. In Singapore, the statutory agencies, they are the ones who are very good in actually implementing plans rather than just leaving them as plans, on the shelf. And then finally, by taking a systemic approach, a systems approach, you can then innovate at the systems level. And this is what we're going to talk about a little bit today to give you some examples so that you kind of hopefully have a better idea of what I'm talking about. And then at the kind of bottom of it all, right, the really foundational layer of the urban systems approach is what we call, dynamic urban governance. It's really governance, right? It's about leadership with vision, but that's also pragmatic. It's about building a culture of integrity, right? To make sure resources are well spent, the right things are being done professionally. It's about cultivating sound institutions, right? The agencies that I talk about, the judicial system, right? And a public service system, and so on. And then, most importantly, I think it's not just about government, it's also about involving the community as stakeholders, and it's about working with the markets and working with the business sector. So these are kind of the 10 principles and the two kind of key foundation layers that constitute the urban systems approach that CLC kind of distilled, from all that we learned, looking at what Singapore has done over the last, 5 or 6 decades, right? And we call this the Singapore Livability Framework. So in a way, if you want to kind of sum it up in one sentence, the urban systems approach, or the livability approach, is really about city leaders and planners having, to plan how they plan, they develop, they manage and maintain cities in an integrated way across many systems. There are systems like housing, like land, environment, transport, to achieve overall outcomes, right? Overall livability outcomes, if you like. Okay, and this approach that we have taken over the years in Singapore has resulted in many systems innovation. And here I just give you a few examples that are probably quite obvious. So for example, water, you look at water as a system, how we solve our water problem, not just, as a resource, but also as an environmental asset, and also as a kind of engine for economic growth, the water industry providing jobs. I think that is a kind of a systemic approach of looking at water, right? Very holistically, systemically, but as a resource, as an environmental asset, and as an economic asset. And I'll say a little bit more about that afterwards. Then the way we green, I think this is also very well known. How do we become a garden city? How do we have so much greenery in Singapore in spite of increasing density? So that again is a systems innovation. And then maybe the most important example of all is, how do we have so many people living in one little island? 5.7 million, 80% of them are housed in highly, dense towns, HDB towns. We all know that, but they are livable and they are socially integrated and they are sustainable. Okay, so these I think are some of our systems innovations. There are others like transport, environment, and so on. And I think in this lecture, all I'm going to do is just give you a few examples, and hopefully it illustrates the principles, right? So let's start with the example that probably I'm a little bit more familiar, water, right? So how have we solved our water problem using the urban systems approach? And in a nutshell, but before I go into that, why is water a problem in Singapore? We are at the equator. We got a lot of rain, 2.4 meters a year annually, right? So actually we have a lot of water falling onto Singapore. But the problem is we are an island. We are just a small little island. So we don't have the land to be able to kind of catch or collect all that water and store it, right? And because we don't have enough land for storage, that water, unfortunately, all is kind of wasted or was wasted, right? Now we're trying to catch a lot more of it. And because of that, water has been an existential problem. Even when we are a colony in the British, they only managed to build 3 reservoirs in the central catchment. And we had to buy water, from our neighbor, Malaysia, right? So that's kind of the story at the point of independence in 1965. We only had 3 reservoirs, and we were very dependent on buying water from Malaysia, right? So for us, ensuring water sustainability was really an existential problem for which you need a really holistic systems approach to solving it. And that systems approach is summarized in this slide, 3 words on each side, right? 6 words altogether: water for all, conserve, value, enjoy. So in other words, looking at water as a resource, you look at the supply side, make sure you have enough different sources of water. But at the same time, on the demand side, make sure you conserve as much water as possible, husband the water because it's a valuable resource. So we took this approach, water for all, conserve, value, enjoy. And the 4 national taps is really, I think many of you have heard of it, is how we have tried to diversify our water sources, right? By number 1, trying to collect as much of the water as we can from the sky, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then, also use technology, to recycle the water, closing the water loop, and also desalination, right? And then the other side of the strategy, it's really demand management, right? It's about making sure people understand the value of water, conserve. It's about pricing policy to price water at its marginal cost and not to subsidize the price of water. I wouldn't say too much about that today. I don't have enough time to give you a full lecture on water. So I'll just touch on a few points, right? So first, if you look at, I say we have a lot of water that falls from the sky, right? But this blue map is only something that happened fairly recently, right? As I told you, we only had 3 reservoirs up to the point of independence. But today, we have 17 reservoirs. So how did that come about? So the problem with collecting water is that we don't have enough land, right? And the other problem is that with urbanization, you're building on the land, you're building housing, you're building factories, and so that water gets polluted. And when it's polluted, then it can't be your water supply. So we had to kind of separate the water into dirty water and clean water, right? Rainwater, stormwater, and dirty water. But dirty water is used water, is sewage. So you need to put in a sanitation system. You need to put in sewage. Okay, so all that is kind of within the water people's purview. But if you want to then collect the water and create more reservoirs, the water engineers have to start working with urban planners, because it's about how to have good land use planning to locate reservoirs, and also to make sure that the way the land is used, whether it's for housing or for factories, there's no, not too much pollution, right? So when the rain falls and it goes into the drains, it doesn't get polluted when it goes into the reservoir. So to be able to create 17 reservoirs is really does require a very holistic systems approach to keep that water clean, right? Through land use planning, through environmental management, and a host of other things, right? So because we took that approach, we are now, I think, one of the very few cities in the world where we are able to do urban stormwater harvesting, right? In other words, collecting water from the most polluted part of the city. I mean, the Marina Reservoir is collecting water from the Central Business District, from Orchard Road, right? All the water that falls in Orchard Road Central Business District goes into the Marina Reservoir. Pongol and Serangoon rivers, which were dammed to become Pongol and Serangoon reservoirs, and I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards, were very polluted areas. It was pig farms. Our landfill was there. There were very pollutive industries in Paya Lebar. So those rivers were very heavily polluted. But today, we have turned them into reservoirs. So that is not just the work of water engineers. I think that requires a systems approach, right? Where many people from different agencies have to work together to make that happen. And closing the water loop is really about the story of new water, the story of desalination, right? You have a natural hydrologic cycle. What water is actually the water that we drink today is the same water that the dinosaurs drank, right? Because water just recycles, it's a renewable resource, right? It evaporates, it comes down again as rain, right? So closing the water loop is really about how can we shorten the hydrologic cycle. In other words, rather than let all that water goes to waste back into the sea after you used it, why can't we capture that water that's been used and then recycle it, right? Reuse and recycle water, and you can do that with technology, right? Using membrane technology, and that's how we have that's how we've been able to create new water, right? Which now it can be responsible for up to 30–40% of our water supply. So closing the water loop is another way of giving us additional sources of water, both in new water as well as desalination. Okay, so this is not a lecture on water. I'm not going to talk too much about this aspect of water, but there's one aspect of water that I think would be of great interest to you guys in integrated sustainable design, and that is the idea of how can we make water a part of our very dense urban landscape, right? So beyond just water as a resource that you use, how can we, instead of having ugly pipes and ugly canals, ugly drains, right? Why can't we turn the ugly engineering infrastructure into beautiful landscapes that can really enhance our urban landscape, our urban environment? So that's the idea behind the Active, Beautiful, and Clean Waters program. I showed you the blue map earlier, right? So you can see how much blue there is, right? We have 17 reservoirs, 32 rivers, 8,000 kilometers of waterways. But unfortunately, a lot of the waterways are actually ugly drains and ugly canals, right? So you imagine if all those ugly drains and ugly canals were naturalized, were beautified, were landscaped, what a difference it will make in terms of livability of our urban environment, right? So that's one of the secrets of how we can try to make Singapore more livable, even as we become more urbanized, right? So here is the perhaps classic example, the ABC Waters program at Kallang River. So this is Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park. I hope many of you, or all of you, have been there. And you can see that this is what it was like, right? It was a park next to, the park was here. This is Bishan town, and then the thing that separated the park and the town was this stormwater canal, right? So we turned that canal, right? When I was at PUB, we turned that canal into a stream, right? Like looking like that. And so today you find that it's a wonderful park with a stream. And in fact, the park has become bigger because all this part of the canal now becomes part of the park. And it becomes a beautiful green and blue attraction. People who used to live next to an ugly canal now live next to a beautiful park, right? So that's how the urban environment can be improved greatly with this kind of, well, sustainable design, if you want to call it that, right? But it comes about if you take a systems approach to thinking about problems and to thinking about design, right? Now the green part I'll just touch on very quickly. What I talk about is water, or the blue part, if you like. The green part I think is probably even more well known. And Singapore has been able to green Singapore even as we urbanize, right? So this slide shows that our green cover, right, meaning the green that is shown when you take the picture of Singapore from a satellite. Although our population grew from 2.7 million to 5 million, that during the same period, this was mid-80s to 2010, the green cover grew from 35.7% to almost 50%, right? Okay, and then of course our challenge is kind of to keep up this story, which is not easy, right? This stops at 2010 because there was a period after 2010 we were building so much MRT and so on, expanding HDB towns. We actually lost a little bit of greenery, but I think NParks is now coming back with a vengeance to try and get back to 50% or maybe go beyond, right, with their latest programs, right? So we've been able to kind of move from being a garden city to now a city in garden, and actually with ABC Waters program, it's now a city of gardens and water, if you like, and I think what NParks is kind of aiming, or all the agencies in the government really, in the Singapore Green Plan of 2030, is really for us, even as we hopefully our urban density will not increase too much. We are already 5.7 million, but even so, there will still be urbanization. And then the question is, how do you, as you urbanize, become more and more livable? And so the idea is, with the green, with the blue, we attract biodiversity. We can then come up with even more innovative ways of making Singapore more livable as we urbanize, right? So in kind of summary, and if you go back to the framework, this set of systemic innovations I just talked about, the green, the blue, the idea of a city in nature, are really, kind of all trying to achieve the outcomes. And here I kind of identify a few outcomes in the kind of sustainable environment bubble, right, of livability outcomes, right? So it's not just city in nature, maybe it's also about how we make good use of our resources, a circular economy, a circular city, right? So that's kind of the environmental part. Let me now go into another outcome, another livability outcome, that of high quality of life, right? So high quality of life is a social outcome, right? In fact, some will argue this is the most important part about being in the city. We want to live in the city because we want to enjoy a high quality of life, a high quality of living. And in Singapore, I think that is kind of been done systemically again, urban systems approach, where we have been able to house 82% of Singaporeans in public housing. We know the story of HDB, that we had slums in the beginning, right? A lot of people living in slums, so we had to have to build high-rise public housing to be able to provide, homes for people. But the approach we took, again, is a systems approach. It's not just about building cheap apartments quickly. It's also about building communities, right? Integrated communities, right? Communities which are safe, which are secure, which are healthy, which are well integrated, where you have people from all social categories, the poor to the rich, different ethnic groups, all living together, right? That's kind of the ideal that we set out to achieve. And we've been able to achieve that through, again, a systems approach. A lot of it is done by HDB. HDB is the integrator, but HDB cannot do it on its own, right? It has to work with the social ministry. It has to work with Ministry of Finance, because the affordability, right? How do you make sure people can afford to buy the flats, through CPF and so on? Lots of policies are needed, right, to be able to achieve an integrated community in an integrated town, right? Sounds very easy when I say it, but actually, it's something that requires a lot of coordination, a lot of working across agencies and so on, right? Across the different policies, right? And it's not just about the living community, right? So we had this plan, long-term plan that we with some help from the United Nations, drew up in 1971. It's called the concept plan. So the concept plan was a way to kind of decentralize the population from the city center, where everybody, the slums were there, everybody was very crowded. We could have 80 to 100 people living in one shop house. And the way to decentralize was really for HDB to build new towns in the suburbs further out. And these are all kind of inclusive new towns, right? But the problem is, it's not just about building new towns, even if they are inclusive. How do you connect these new towns, right? So that people can easily, move about or go to work. Right? If they're working in the city or they're working in the airport, the industrial area, how do they get to work? So transport and mobility is also a very important aspect of quality of life, right? Housing, integrated community, but high quality of life, transport and mobility. And I talk about the concept plan, right? So the concept plan was really a plan. We were less than 2 million. So the concept plan was really a plan for a modern city of 3.5 million. And then the question is, okay, how do you place, where do people live, the 3.5 million people? So they place them in new towns. The concept plan was called a ring plan. It was around the central catchment area. All the towns were around the central catchment area. The airport was in the east and the port was in the west, right? So that was basically simple idea for the concept plan. But to make that simple idea work, you need to have the right transport network, right? You need to build the MRT, the expressways, and so on. So the plan had to be executed, and it was executed by the predecessor of LTA, Public Works Department, MRTC. And so, transport and mobility is something that goes hand in hand, really, with planning for other users like housing, right? So at the end of the day, when we do planning, when you do urban planning, it has to be done in a very integrated way, looking at what you use on the piece of land, as well as how you move people around. So land use and transport planning are very, very much integrated. Again, it's a systems approach, right? So that's quality of life, right? The housing, the transport, mobility, but there are other things, right? Safety, security, heritage, identity, all those quality of life, food, right? Hawker centers and so on. And each one of these, again, we can go into it. And the CLC Urban System Studies, if you are interested, does cover a lot of these. By now, I think there are about 40 of these. So if you are interested in any particular area, you can just go onto the CLC website and read up a lot about, how we took a systems approach to tackle some of these issues. All right, and then okay, so quality of life, like I did for sustainable environment. If you go back to the livability framework, again, you can identify a whole bunch of livability outcomes under quality of life, and you can measure this. And at the end of the day, what urban policy makers are all trying to do, how do we achieve these outcomes, right? Okay, so but actually the important thing is not to achieve each of these bubbles in isolation. So quality of life, yes, but you have to have high quality of life in a sustainable environment. And you cannot have high quality of life and sustainable environment if you cannot pay for it, right? So the competitive economy is so important, right? Because that's the fundamental, that gives you the jobs and then allow the city to be competitive, to earn the money, to be able to sustain itself, right? So all three bubbles must come together, and very often huge conflicts, right? If I want the land for housing, I may also need the same piece of land for a factory, right? Or for a park, right? So, and you see these controversies spill out sometimes in the newspapers, right? You've heard about Dover Forest, right? Do we keep the forest, but then we have a need for housing 20,000 people? So that's a conflict. So that's where you need a systems approach, and you need innovation, you need ideas, right? And that's where a course like this, integrated sustainable design, right? You need to kind of come up with creative ideas, how to solve very, very difficult, challenging problems, right? So the economy is one good example. This is kind of the foundation, right, of Singapore's success as a city, right? You must be able to be competitive. So we started off being an entrepreneur, a port city, right? But then we moved on to the manufacturing. So we need to be able to find the land for manufacturing. initially labor intensive, so we created Jurong Industrial Estate. Later on, we moved into high value added business parks. And then we moved into a knowledge economy. So we have One North and places like that. Today we have Jurong Innovation District, Pongol Digital District. So we have to kind of keep on innovating, at the systems level to be able to help Singapore, be competitive. Of course, we work together. JTC works together with EDB, IE Singapore, the economic agencies to be able, to sustain our competitive advantage, right? And so in the overall planning scheme of things, we have to identify where the employment centers, right? The business districts, the regional center, the central business district, the gateways, the economic gateways, the airport, the port, and then what we call the tech corridors, knowledge corridors, centered around cities. So as urban planners, you have to be able to kind of take a systems approach and look at how all these sustain, the city's competitiveness. Okay, so those again, that third bubble, competitive economy, those are three kind of indicators of success for a competitive economy. But as I said, all three must be able to come together if you want to achieve a balanced development outcome. Okay, so coming to the foundational layers, right? Back to the two foundational layers are really about how do we have integrated planning and how do we do good governance, right? So I will talk about it briefly because this can be, it's really a subject for School of Public Policy, and I won't want to go too much into that. But we have a way of trying to integrate the way we plan long term and bringing all the competing needs together. We call it our urban planning system, right? And it's very simple. Basically, the idea is we have a long-term plan that look at 50 or 100 years ahead. We call it a concept plan, right? The first one was done with the help of UNDP, United Nations Development Program, in 1971. Since then, every 10 years, we update that because things change, right? Socioeconomic circumstances change. So we have to keep on updating plan. Right now, URA is in the midst of revising, the concept plan. They call it the long-term plan now. The second level, you kind of cascade that very long-term plan, to a more fine-grained level. We call it a master plan, shorter time horizon. It's also a statutory plan. So this is a plan that developers must pay close attention to. It spells out what is the allowable land use, the density or plot ratio, and this one is revised every 5 years, right? And then at the very more micro level, we have urban design guide plans and development control guidelines, right? Which goes into really very detailed, things like setbacks, site coverage and so on. Okay, so we have a pretty good way of trying to make sure that the different needs of the city are somehow arbitrated, and somehow we come to some conclusion. There are various committees that does that, and then of course at the highest level, the cabinet will make the critical decisions. But this is the way then we are able to make sure our plan, is a consistent, coherent plan and can get implemented, the way that we've been doing it, right? So again, a systems approach. And then governance is really not just about government. We tend to think of governance as a government, but it's more than just government. It's really a triangle, right? Government, private enterprise, people, and communities. And then I put in the center of this slide, the 5 principles that I've talked about earlier, right? So this is actually very important because without governance, you can have the best plans in the world, but things will not happen, right? The way that you want it to happen. You need laws, right? You need guidelines, right? You need experts in government. You need experts in the private sector, in the university, to be able to translate a lot of these ideas into something that is practical. And most importantly, you need people, to actually understand, what these plans and what the policies are. But increasingly, I think people also want to have a say and participate, right? So all this is about governance, right? Okay, so I'm going to, in the hopefully next remaining time, give you a few couple of case studies that is kind of perhaps closer to what you guys are doing, integrated sustainable design. So I'm going to talk about Marina Bay in the first instance, and then I'm going to talk about Pongol, right? So first, let's talk about Marina Bay, right? The downtown. I think the planning for the downtown started in the 70s, right? And for those of you who are maybe less familiar with Singapore, all that you see in this photo and the models of the buildings to the left, right? To the left of the Padang, right? And the Victoria Memorial Hall and Council Hall. All this was the sea, right? All this was land that was reclaimed from the sea. There was nothing there in the 60s and 70s. Well, the 60s right up to the 70s, right? And only in the 70s that we started to reclaim the land. And this is an example of long-term planning, but at the same time flexibility, right? So when I show you this slide, you will understand why. So we started doing a little bit of reclamation in the 60s. Why? Because we wanted to build the East Coast Parkway. You know the East Coast Parkway, right? That goes in Marina Center. So the engineers wanted to build the East Coast Parkway, so they created. They said, okay, we need to reclaim a bit of land to build the bridge. But then later on, they found that no, we wanted to also reclaim some land around the Telok Ayer Basin, because I think the urban planners wanted to kind of see this as a kind of extension of the city. But you can see that slowly planners in time got a little bit more ambitious. We started to reclaim off the East Coast Park. Then 1980, we really got even more ambitious, and the amount of land got bigger and bigger. So by 1919, when we kind of engaged some international consultants, they say, why didn't you go a lot more? And this is kind of almost the profile that we see today, right? Since then, I think we have a little bit more, but for the cruise terminal, a little bit more for the Marina Coastal Expressway, and maybe in the future we could reclaim a little bit more, not much more, right? But you can see that it is something that evolves. You have a long-term plan. You want to kind of reclaim, to expand the city into the reclaimed land. But as you go along, you come up with new ideas. So there's always flexibility in the planning, right? And the planning really had been going on for a long, long time. You can see here 1983, right? That's when we invited IMP and Kenzo Tange to do plans, two different plans. Then the URA had, in a way, got to kind of not quite merge, but look at the merits of both plans and created, kind of our own plan that was done by URA planners, right? And the vision for Marina Bay, I think, is a different one from the old downtown, right? The old downtown is Shenton Way, Raffles Place, primarily office buildings, so it's kind of quiet at night. But the idea of the new downtown, it is a 24/7 live, work, play environment, right? Mixed use, captures the essence of a global city, right? So you can see that's kind of, you see there are hotels, there are residential areas, and some very interesting features in the new downtown. And really the new downtown, one thing that made it possible was the reclaiming of land, right? The other thing that made it interesting, possible, was the water part, right? So Singapore River was, as I showed you earlier, very polluted. Then there was a 10-year river cleanup effort, 1977 to 1987. And again, a huge program involving 14 agencies and ministries, again, systems approach to be able to kind of clean up the river, lay new sewers, resettle squatters, businesses, cottage industries that were polluted. And then you clean up the river in 10 years. I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew actually challenged the civil service, let there be fishing. The 77, the river was like an open sewer. in 10 years' time, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, we better bring the fish back to the river. And it happened. And so the river got cleaned up. And when the cleanup happened, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew then had this vision that, why don't we put a barrage? And then we turned the Marina Bay into a freshwater lake, right? Actually, the barrage was needed because we wanted to prevent flooding, right? And then the idea was, okay, instead of just a tight gate, right, which you open and let water go after the heavy rain is over, you make it a dam, right? You make it both a barrage and as well as a dam, so that you can then collect the water and then you have another reservoir. And I'll say a little bit about Marina Barrage afterwards, right? So Singapore River cleanup also created tremendous opportunity for us to expand the city into the Marina Bay, right? So it's called the Marina Bay because of the Marina Barrage. And so the new city actually is fantastic in the sense that it's reclaimed land, but it's got this water feature, right? All around the reclaimed land, right? The Marina Bay is like a St. Mark's Square in Venice, right? So instead of a St. Mark's Square, we have a water St. Mark's Square, right? Where a lot of things can happen in the water, sailing activities and so on. Now we have a National Day Parade, and the National Day Parade partly can take place in the water, right? So the city, in a way, you know, Marina Bay, in a way, has got the advantage of this wonderful water, you know, this wonderful bay, this wonderful reservoir, because we cleaned up the river, we turned this into a reservoir, and so the Marina Barrage now actually is one of the innovations, one of the systemic innovations, because it does three things, right? It boosts our water supply, it's our 15th reservoir. You know, it is also a tidal barrier, so it prevents Orchard Road, Little India, Shenton Way from flooding, because it, you know, it prevents the high tide from overwhelming the city. And then, you know, it is, as I say, a St. Mark's Square, so it's a lifestyle attraction, you know, in downtown Singapore. It makes the city a city that's around a lake, you know, or a bay. Okay, so in a way, this is kind of trying to kind of summarize in a nutshell how we took the urban systems approach to create our new city, our new downtown. Okay, and I think that to me is a good example of when we talk about integrated sustainable design, right? And a lot of this, we involve the community. Certainly, when we were figuring out how to open up the Marina Barrage, I think we had a lot of workshops with the community. Okay, so I think that's Marina Bay. Let me carry on with Pongol quickly. Pongol is a new town in the northeast of Singapore, and the northeast of Singapore is really a part of Singapore that was quite badly polluted, right? So I told you about Pongol River, Sungai River, and Serangoon River. They were both very polluted because of all these things, right? The pig farm. There was also a landfill. Now, today we incinerate our waste, but earlier on we actually dumped the waste into a landfill in this area called Lorong Halus, right? So this was a very badly polluted area, and so there has to be a lot of environmental cleanup before we could introduce population in this area, right? So the history of Pongol is one where it was kind of quite polluted, quite blighted. And then the idea was, all right, when we created these two reservoirs, why don't we link up the two reservoirs instead of with a pipe? Why don't we design a waterway? So another example of systemic innovation, integrated design, have a waterway rather than a pipe that runs through the town. So this town really is a waterfront town. It's got this waterway, it's got the two reservoirs, you know, and then it's got the Coney Island, which is an island that was capped, and then the waterway between the island and the main island is capped. It's got the LRT and of course town centers and so on, right? So that's the explanation of the waterway and some pictures of what it looks like today, right now that it's been developed. And Lorong Halus, I mentioned it. It was, you know, these green hills are actually the old rubbish, right? The old landfill, and it's stacked so high it becomes a hill. Over the years, the greenery has grown, but I think methane continues to be extracted. There continues to be leachate, polluted stuff that goes into the river, into Serangoon Reservoir. So PUB has to install a system of wells and pumps to pump out all that polluted water and then treat it in these what is called natural wetlands, right? So actually these natural wetlands, this is kind of a picture taken in the early days, but today it's kind of all very nicely green, and it becomes a nice attraction for people to kind of enjoy, understanding how the water is kept clean. It's an educational attraction as well. So another example of systemic, design, right? Sustainable design. There's a coastal promenade along the northern part, where it flanks all the water in Pongol. And well, those are the two examples of integrated sustainable design. I'm going to kind of spend the last few minutes kind of looking a little bit ahead. What are the challenges that we face? That Singapore will continue to face. We are not going to be more than an island, where we are going to continue to be a city state, and so we continue to face challenges, and many of these are systemic challenges or existential challenges, if you like. So right now we are in the middle of one, pandemic, and people are talking about what's the next one, disease X, right? Climate change, you just heard a lot about it last week with the IPCC report. Quote rate, economic risk is always a problem for us. We have to kind of always try to keep on surviving. Ecological problems, which could be linked to the rest, and then technological risk, right? With advances in technology, you get the good and the bad. So how do we then continue to be livable, to be sustainable, to be resilient, right? We have to keep on innovating at the systems level. We have to keep on coming out with urban systems innovation. And more than that, we can't just do it accidentally. I think in the past we solved it, but we kind of never really had a systematic way of doing it. So I think now, to me, the role of the university is really to study the principles, see how to apply the principles, develop more theory, do more research. And that's why I think urban systems research, which CLC was doing, which I think a lot is also being done in the US, is something that we need to keep on doing to address our key urban challenges. And this is a kind of a roadmap that I did when I was at CLC about urban systems research, right? And you can see that there's an upstream part where we need to kind of develop a science of cities. There's the applied stuff at the city level and at the district level. And then how do you actually translate all these ideas, right? And we have agencies that are also involved in research, right? So this is kind of what I think is needed if we want to continue with our urban systems innovation. We will always have challenges, but as I say, the title of the talk, every challenge represents an opportunity. And so far, we have been pretty good at taking advantage we've been pretty good in overcoming our challenges and creating new opportunities. But it's not just about livability and sustainability, because I think you hear a lot of people talk about livability, about sustainability, about resilience, and I want to show in this chart, in this graph, the relationship among these three ideas, right? Livability, I've explained it in the framework, right? You want to have the three sets of livability outcomes can be measured. Sustainability, I think, has been defined in many places. The idea that you don't use up all the resources, but you leave something for the generations, right, ahead, right? Your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren for another 100 years. So don't squander our resources, don't destroy the city or the planet. So sustainability is really living, making something sustainable for a long, long time. But resilience is a slightly different concept. Is the idea that if the city suffers a shock, right, like a pandemic or climate change, right, then how do you recover from that shock? And not just recover, how do you, after you recover, thrive and do even better. So if you see the red line here, this is what we want to be, right? Livability and sustainability along this upward sloping path. But if you get a shock like a pandemic, so we had a pandemic, well, we had COVID, economic growth went down, a lot of livelihoods affected. Question then is, how do you bounce back? Not just bounce back and continue on the same line, but bounce back and go and do even better, right? So this is kind of, when you take a systems approach and you think about the resilience, I think this is how you want to think about it. And indeed, in Singapore, the policymakers and agencies are thinking along these lines, emerging stronger after COVID, right? And if you look at one aspect which is important to Singapore, climate change, right? So we just heard about it last week. IPCC report, the UN Secretary General said, it is saying code red for humanity. Singapore, we are a little island, right? So we are not very high. So we suffer potential vulnerability, sea level rise, extreme weather, whether it is flooding or drought, and then heat, right? We are at the equator, we are very hot and humid. So all these are impacts on climate change that our agencies, the Ministry of Sustainable Environment, the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister himself has said that this is extremely important for Singapore, and he has committed, the policy and the budget, right, 100 billion over next 100 years to ensure that we are resilient to climate change, and it's a huge challenge for us. This was a kind of a diagram I did when I was at CLC to show that to address something by climate change using the systems approach. These are all the different subsystems and the linkages between stakeholders to tackle the problem, and then what's the outcome that we want, right? So when you do a kind of systems analysis in a more systematic, structured way, this is how we kind of think about the problem, right? And then a lot of research is going on at NUS, NTU, in the agencies. Some of them are shown here. And then, of course, trying to put it all together, taking cognizance of all the challenges that we face to plan for longer term for Singapore, 2030 and actually beyond. We have a Singapore Green Plan that was just announced earlier in the year, and a lot of the ideas that I talked about, are actually captured in this Green Plan. Because here again, we have taken a kind of very systemic approach to look at how we want to tackle our biggest urban challenges using an urban systems approach, right? And at the end of the day, well, we can do all this for Singapore, but how about the rest of the world? What is it that we can learn, right? And we can share with the rest of the world, other cities especially. So, we have been sharing our knowledge with other cities, and we've been creating a platform. The CLC has been creating a platform for cities to share their knowledge, best practice cities like the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize winners, Medellin, Seoul, Bilbao. And then the World City Summit is a kind of biannual platform, a conference, right, where city leaders, where academics, students, business people, community get together, right, to talk about the challenges of cities and to share best practice and knowledge, and to network, and really to learn from each other, right? So Singapore, I think we have done well. We should continue, I hope, to do well with people like you, learning about integrated sustainable design, and how do we then keep on not just solving our own problems and coming up with our own systems innovation, but also learn from other cities and share with other cities, right? So I think that's kind of our challenge and our opportunity, right? So with that, I end my lecture, and I will be happy to take questions.